Welcome to One Book, One Coffee. Today, we're diving into a book that stands apart in the realm of sociological and psychological literature. By choosing to explore Escape from Freedom by Erich Fromm, you've already distinguished yourself from the crowd. In a world bustling with endless social media feeds and the latest binge-worthy shows, you've opted to delve into a piece that challenges the very essence of society's fabric and our individual place within it. Escape from Freedom is not just a book. It's an exploration of the human psyche and its relationship with freedom in the context of societal changes. It's a book that matters because it uncovers the paradoxical nature of freedom, how it can lead to both empowerment and a sense of isolation. This profound inquiry into the human condition has been revered by many, including the eminent philosopher and historian Isaiah Berlin, who praised Fromm's insights into freedom's double-edged sword. The author, Erich Fromm, was a German social psychologist, psychoanalyst, and humanistic philosopher. Fleeing the rise of Nazism, Fromm relocated to the United States, where he confronted the cultural upheavals of his time. His experiences during this tumultuous era deeply influenced his writings, driving him to explore the psychological challenges posed by newfound liberties and the fear that often accompanies them. Now, a quick note before we dive in. This is a detailed chapter-by-chapter walkthrough, so it's going to be a longer session. Take your time with it. There's no rush. If you need to step away, save this video to your watch later or forward the link to yourself on WhatsApp so you can pick up right where you left off. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's walk through this book together, chapter by chapter, idea by idea. Let's begin. The Paradox of Freedom in a Modern World. Erich Fromm was a German social psychologist who fled Nazi Germany and became an influential thinker in the United States, exploring the psychological challenges of freedom. Picture this. You're sitting in a cozy coffee shop on a rainy afternoon, and your friend leans across the table with that look in their eyes that says they've just discovered something profound. That's exactly the conversation Erich Fromm wants to have with us about freedom, and trust me, it's going to challenge everything you thought you knew about what it means to be truly free. Now, most of us have been raised on this beautiful myth that freedom is simply the absence of chains, right? We break free from oppression, we escape tyranny, and voila, we're free. But Fromm sits us down with the patience of a wise mentor and says, hold on a minute. What if I told you that freedom isn't just about escaping from something, but also about what happens after you've escaped? What if freedom itself can become the very thing that terrifies us most? Think about it this way. Imagine you've lived your entire life in a small town where everyone knows exactly what's expected of them. Your father was a baker, so you become a baker. Your neighbor's daughter marries the blacksmith's son because that's how things work. Every decision, every path, every choice has been predetermined by tradition, by authority, by the comfortable weight of how things have always been done. Then suddenly, one day, all those rules disappear. You're standing in the middle of an endless field with 1,000 different paths stretching out before you, and someone says, "Go ahead. Choose any direction you want." Sounds liberating, doesn't it? But here's the twist that Fromm wants us to understand. That moment of infinite possibility can be absolutely paralyzing. This is what Fromm calls the dual nature of freedom, and it's perhaps one of the most important insights about human psychology you'll ever encounter. Freedom, he argues, is simultaneously our greatest gift and our heaviest burden. It's like being handed the keys to a magnificent car when you've never learned to drive, thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Let's take a modern example that'll hit close to home. Think about graduation day from college. You walk across that stage, diploma in hand, and everyone's cheering about how free you are now, how the world is your oyster. But what's the first thing that happens? Panic sets in. What career should I choose? Where should I live? Who should I become? Suddenly, the structure of school schedules and required courses doesn't seem so oppressive anymore. It seems almost comforting in its predictability. Fromm observed this pattern throughout history, and it explains so much about why people sometimes choose authoritarianism over democracy, why they surrender their hard-won freedoms to charismatic leaders who promise to make all the difficult decisions for them. It's not that people don't want freedom, it's that they want freedom from the anxiety that comes with freedom itself. Here's where Fromm's insight becomes absolutely crucial for understanding our modern world. We're living in an age of unprecedented freedom. We can choose our careers, our partners, our beliefs, even our identities in ways that previous generations couldn't imagine. But have you noticed how many people seem more anxious, more depressed, more lost than ever before? That's not a coincidence. That's the burden of freedom manifesting itself in real time. Now think about this. When faced with the overwhelming responsibility of self-determination, what do people often do? They escape. Not by running away to a desert island, but by escaping into conformity, into mindless consumerism, into the comfort of letting algorithms decide what they should watch, buy, or even think. They trade their authentic freedom for the illusion of choice, 37 flavors of ice cream, but all from the same corporate manufacturer. Fromm saw this coming decades ago. He understood that true freedom isn't just the absence of external constraints. It's the courage to embrace the responsibility that comes with choice, the willingness to face uncertainty, and most importantly, the development of our own authentic sense of self. Real freedom requires us to become the authors of our own lives, not just actors reading from scripts written by others. But here's the beautiful part of Fromm's message, and why this conversation over coffee matters so much. He's not telling us to fear freedom or to retreat into comfortable cages. Instead, he's showing us that understanding the dual nature of freedom is the first step toward embracing it fully. When we recognize that the anxiety we feel when faced with choices is natural, when we understand that the burden of freedom is part of its gift, we can stop running from it and start growing into it. As we settle deeper into our conversation about human nature and society, this understanding of freedom's complexity becomes our foundation for everything else Fromm wants to share. Because once we grasp that freedom is both liberation and responsibility, both opportunity and burden, we can begin to understand why entire societies sometimes choose to escape from it, and more importantly, how we can choose differently. Picture this. You're sitting in a medieval village, and everyone around you knows exactly who they are without ever having to think about it. The blacksmith's son will be a blacksmith, the farmer's daughter will tend the land, and nobody questions whether they're living their authentic self or following their passion. Sounds suffocating to us today, doesn't it? But here's what Fromm wants us to understand as we dive deeper into his masterpiece. This certainty, this lack of individual choice, actually provided something we've lost in our modern world, a profound sense of security and belonging. Now, think about this for a moment. When was the last time you lay awake at night wondering who you really are, what your purpose is, or whether you're making the right choices? These very questions that keep us up scrolling through self-help articles and career advice would have been completely foreign to someone living 500 years ago. Fromm argues that this emergence of individual consciousness, this birth of the self as we know it, is one of the most dramatic transformations in human history, and it came with a price we're still paying today. Let's travel back to understand how we got here. In medieval society, what Fromm calls the primary bonds held everything together like invisible threads. These bonds weren't just social customs. They were the very fabric of existence. A person's identity was woven into their family lineage, their guild, their village, their place in the great chain of being that stretched from peasant to king to God himself. Imagine wearing a sweater that's been knitted so tightly that you can't tell where one thread ends and another begins. That was medieval life. No clear boundaries between individual and community, between personal desire and social role. But then something extraordinary began to happen. The Renaissance didn't just bring us beautiful art and scientific discoveries. It cracked open the shell of collective identity and let the individual soul peek out. Suddenly, artists were signing their names to their work. Merchants were traveling to distant lands, making decisions based on profit and personal ambition rather than inherited duty. The printing press meant that ideas could spread faster than village gossip, and people began to encounter thoughts and possibilities that had never existed in their small, contained worlds. Here's where Fromm's insight becomes fascinating. This emergence of individuality wasn't just about gaining freedom. It was about losing the warm, unquestioning embrace of belonging. Think about a child leaving home for college. Yes, they gain independence, the ability to choose their major, their friends, their lifestyle. But they also lose the comfort of mom's cooking, the security of their childhood bedroom, the simple clarity of being someone's son or daughter first and foremost. The Renaissance did this to entire civilizations. Consider how this plays out in our modern world. We celebrate individual achievement, personal branding, finding your unique voice. We tell young people to follow their dreams and be themselves. But have you noticed how anxious this makes people? Walk into any coffee shop and you'll overhear conversations about imposter syndrome, quarter-life crises, the pressure to create a perfect life for social media. We've gained the freedom to become anyone we want, but we've lost the roadmap that once told us who we were supposed to be. Fromm illustrates this beautifully through the metaphor of the umbilical cord. In the womb, we're completely connected, completely provided for, completely secure. But we can't grow without cutting that cord. The emergence of individual consciousness is humanity's collective cutting of the umbilical cord with tradition, with predetermined roles, with the certainty of belonging. We gain the ability to think, to choose, to create ourselves. But we also gain the burden of responsibility for our own lives. Now think about this in your own experience. How many times have you envied people who seem to have unwavering faith, whether religious or otherwise? People who never question their path, who sleep soundly knowing they're exactly where they're supposed to be. There's something in us that remembers that medieval certainty, that longs for the simplicity of predetermined purpose. But we can't go back, and Fromm argues we shouldn't want to. The emergence of the individual created what he calls the burden of freedom, a theme that will echo throughout our entire journey together. We became free to think, but that meant we had to face the anxiety of choice. We became free to love, but that meant we had to risk rejection. We became free to create meaning, but that meant we had to confront the possibility of meaninglessness. As we move forward in our exploration, we'll see how this fundamental shift created the psychological conditions that would later make people susceptible to authoritarianism. When freedom becomes too heavy a burden, when individual choice creates too much anxiety, people begin to long for someone else to make the decisions. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let's sit with this profound truth. We are the inheritors of a great liberation that came with an equally great responsibility, and understanding this tension is the key to understanding ourselves. Picture yourself sitting in a medieval village square around 1500, where for centuries the same stone church has dominated the skyline, its bells marking not just the hours but the rhythm of everyone's life. The priest tells you what to believe, the guild master dictates your trade, and the lord of the manor determines your fate. Your identity isn't really yours. It's woven into this tapestry of tradition, hierarchy, and unquestioned authority. But then something extraordinary happens. A German monk named Martin Luther nails his revolutionary ideas to a church door, and suddenly the world begins to crack open. This is where Fromm takes us in his exploration of freedom during the Reformation, a period that would fundamentally reshape what it means to be human. Now, think about this. What happens when the very foundations of certainty are suddenly swept away? When the institutions that have told you who you are for 1,000 years are suddenly questioned? The Reformation wasn't just about religious doctrine. It was about the birth of the modern individual, with all the exhilarating possibilities and terrifying responsibilities that come with it. Before the Reformation, medieval people lived in what we might call a spiritual straitjacket, but it was a comfortable one. The Catholic Church provided answers to every conceivable question. Where did you come from? God created you. What's your purpose? To serve God and your earthly superiors. What happens when you die? Follow the rules and salvation awaits. Your local priest was like a spiritual GPS system. He told you exactly where you were and precisely how to reach your destination. There was security in this system, a deep sense of belonging that came from knowing your place in God's grand design. But then Luther and other reformers came along with a revolutionary message. You don't need a priest to talk to God. You can read the Bible yourself. You can have a direct, personal relationship with the divine. Imagine the psychological earthquake this created. Suddenly, peasants and merchants were being told they could interpret Scripture as well as any bishop. The middleman between human and divine was being eliminated. It was like someone suddenly announcing that you don't need a travel agent anymore. You can book your own spiritual journey. This sounds liberating, doesn't it? And in many ways it was. The Protestant emphasis on individual conscience gave birth to the idea that each person has inherent dignity and worth. No longer were you just a cog in the great medieval machine. You were a unique soul with direct access to God. This theological shift laid the groundwork for everything we value about modern democracy and human rights. When we talk about individual freedom today, we're still building on foundations laid by Reformation thinkers. But here's where Fromm's insight becomes fascinating and deeply relevant to our modern struggles. He shows us that this newfound freedom came with a price tag that many people found too expensive to pay. When you're told you can choose your own relationship with God, you're also being told that your salvation depends entirely on your choices. The security blanket of guaranteed salvation through church membership was suddenly ripped away. Now you had to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, as the Apostle Paul put it. Think about how this mirrors our modern anxiety about choice. Walk into any grocery store and you'll find 30 different types of breakfast cereal. Open a dating app and you'll see thousands of potential partners. Choose a career path from seemingly infinite possibilities. This abundance of choice, which should make us happy, often leaves us paralyzed and anxious. Are we making the right choices? What if we're missing out on something better? The Reformation created the first version of this modern dilemma, the burden of individual responsibility. Fromm brilliantly shows us how many people responded to this new freedom by essentially running away from it. Some threw themselves into frantic religious activity, trying to earn their salvation through good works and moral perfectionism. Others retreated into rigid fundamentalism, creating new forms of authority to replace the old ones they'd rejected. Sound familiar? In our own time, we see people overwhelmed by the complexity of modern life seeking refuge in conspiracy theories, authoritarian leaders, or extreme ideologies that promise simple answers to complicated questions. The Protestant work ethic that emerged from this period perfectly illustrates this escape from freedom. Success in business became a sign of divine favor, so people threw themselves into work with religious fervor. But this wasn't really freedom. It was a new form of compulsion, a way of avoiding the anxiety of choice by making productivity and achievement the new gods. We're still living with the psychological residue of this today. In our culture's obsession with optimization, productivity, and the relentless pursuit of success as a form of secular salvation. What makes this historical analysis so powerful is how it illuminates our current moment. We live in an age of unprecedented individual freedom, yet we see people everywhere seeking escape from that freedom. Whether through social media echo chambers, consumer culture, or political tribalism. The Reformation shows us that this tension between freedom and security isn't new. It's been the central human struggle for over 500 years, and understanding this history helps us navigate our own complicated relationship with choice, responsibility, and authentic living. You know how sometimes you get exactly what you thought you wanted, only to realize it wasn't what you needed at all? Well, That's exactly the paradox Erich Fromm wants us to wrestle with as we dive deeper into his brilliant analysis of human freedom. We've been exploring how modern humanity broke free from medieval chains, but now Fromm reveals something fascinating and a little unsettling about the nature of freedom itself. Picture this scene with me for a moment. It's like finally moving out of your parents' house after years of dreaming about independence. You've got your own apartment, your own keys, nobody telling you when to come home or what to eat for dinner. Freedom at last, right? But then, 3 weeks later, you're sitting alone on a Saturday night, scrolling through your phone, wondering why this liberation feels so empty. This is exactly what Fromm means when he talks about the two faces of freedom that modern humanity has encountered. Fromm argues that freedom isn't just one thing. It's actually two completely different experiences that we often confuse with each other. There's what he calls freedom from and freedom to. Now, think about this distinction because it's absolutely crucial to understanding why so many people in our modern world feel simultaneously more free and more anxious than ever before. Freedom from is the negative aspect of freedom. It's breaking chains, escaping restrictions, throwing off the yoke of authority. When medieval serfs were no longer bound to their lord's land, that was freedom from. When people stopped having to accept the church's word as the final authority on everything from science to morality, that was freedom from. When you quit that soul-crushing job where your boss micromanaged every minute of your day, that's freedom from. It feels incredible in the moment, like taking off shoes that have been pinching your feet all day. But here's where it gets interesting and where Fromm's insight becomes almost prophetic when you look at our current world. Freedom from by itself is actually a pretty hollow victory. It tells you what you're not, but it doesn't tell you what you are. It removes obstacles, but it doesn't provide direction. Think about someone who's just gotten divorced after years in an unhappy marriage. Yes, they're free from conflict, free from compromise, free from someone else's expectations. But now what? Who are they when they're not defined in opposition to someone else? This is where freedom to comes in. And it's the positive aspect of freedom that Fromm argues is much harder to achieve. Freedom, too, is about self-realization, about the spontaneous expression of your authentic self, about creating meaning and purpose from your own inner resources. It's not just the absence of chains, it's the presence of wings. But here's the catch that Fromm identifies so brilliantly. Wings require strength, skill, and most importantly, the courage to use them. Let me give you a modern example that perfectly illustrates this dilemma. Consider the explosion of choice we have today compared to previous generations. Walk into any grocery store and you'll find 37 different types of breakfast cereal, each promising to be the key to your morning happiness. Open a dating app and you have access to thousands of potential partners. Choose a career path and you're told the sky's the limit. Follow your passion. Be anything you want to be. This is freedom from the limited options our grandparents had. But how many people do you know who feel paralyzed by all these choices? How many spend hours scrolling through Netflix, unable to decide what to watch, eventually settling on rewatching The Office for the 100th time? Fromm saw this coming decades before the internet existed. He understood that when you remove traditional structures, authorities, and predetermined paths, you don't automatically create happy, fulfilled people. Instead, you often create anxious, overwhelmed individuals who don't know how to handle the responsibility of self-determination. Freedom to requires something that freedom from doesn't. It requires a strong sense of self, what Fromm calls spontaneous activity and positive relatedness to the world. Think about the difference between a teenager rebelling against their parents' rules and that same person, years later, building a life based on their own values and vision. The rebellion is freedom from, the life building is freedom to. One is reactive, the other is creative. One is about rejecting what others want for you, the other is about discovering and expressing what you want for yourself. This distinction helps explain so much about our contemporary struggles. We live in an era of unprecedented freedom from traditional constraints, Yet anxiety, depression, and a sense of meaninglessness seem to be epidemic. We've gotten very good at throwing off external authorities, but we've struggled to develop the internal authority, the authentic selfhood, that true freedom requires. As we continue our journey through Fromm's insights, we'll discover that this tension between the two aspects of freedom isn't just an abstract philosophical problem. It's the central psychological challenge of modern life, and understanding it is the first step toward reclaiming the kind of freedom that actually makes us human. Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a diving board for the first time, looking down at the water below. Your heart pounds as you realize that nobody can make this jump for you. This moment of pure, terrifying freedom is exactly what Erich Fromm is talking about when he describes the human condition. But here's the thing that might surprise you, most of us, when faced with that diving board moment: don't jump. Instead, we climb back down the ladder, and Fromm wants us to understand exactly how and why we do this. In this pivotal section of Escape from Freedom, Fromm pulls back the curtain on something we all do but rarely admit to ourselves. He identifies the clever, often unconscious ways we dodge the weight of our own freedom. Think about it for a moment. When was the last time you had to make a really important decision, one that would genuinely shape your life? Did you feel excited by the possibilities, or did you feel that familiar knot in your stomach, that voice whispering that maybe someone else should decide for you? Fromm introduces us to what he calls the mechanisms of escape, and they're far more sophisticated than simply running away. The first mechanism he explores is authoritarianism, but not the kind you might imagine from history books. This isn't just about following dictators. It's about the subtle ways we surrender our decision-making power every single day. Consider the person who constantly asks their friends what they should do, not because they value the advice, but because they want someone else to bear the responsibility for the outcome. Or think about how we sometimes throw ourselves completely into following a charismatic leader, whether that's a boss, a guru, or even a social media influencer, allowing their voice to drown out our own inner compass. What makes this particularly fascinating is how this authoritarian escape can work in two directions. Sometimes we submit to authority, becoming what Fromm calls the masochistic type, people who find relief in being told what to do, think, and feel. But other times, we flip the script entirely and become the authority ourselves, the sadistic type who controls others to avoid confronting our own freedom. Now, think about this. Have you ever found yourself being unusually controlling in a relationship or situation? Often, it's not because we're naturally domineering, but because controlling others feels safer than facing the uncertainty of our own choices. The second escape mechanism Fromm identifies is what he calls destructiveness. This isn't necessarily about physical violence, though it can be. It's about the impulse to tear down, to criticize, to find fault with everything around us. When we feel overwhelmed by the possibilities that freedom presents, sometimes we try to eliminate those possibilities entirely. Picture someone who constantly complains about their job, their relationships, their city, their government. Everything is wrong. Everything needs to be destroyed or completely changed. What they're really doing, Fromm suggests, is trying to destroy the very world that demands they make choices. This destructive impulse shows up in surprisingly mundane ways. The person who sabotages their own relationships right when they start getting serious, the student who stops trying right before exams, the entrepreneur who finds reasons to abandon their business plan just as it's gaining momentum. It's easier to destroy the possibility than to bear the weight of potentially failing, or even more terrifyingly, potentially succeeding, and then having to live up to that success. But perhaps the most prevalent escape mechanism in our modern world is what Fromm calls automaton conformity. This is where things get really interesting for us today, because this mechanism has been supercharged by social media and consumer culture. Automaton conformity is when we adopt the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that our culture expects from us so completely that we lose touch with our authentic selves. We become what Fromm describes as pseudo-selves, functioning human beings who have essentially outsourced their identity to society. Think about how this plays out in your own life. How many of your preferences are actually yours, and how many are just what you've absorbed from your environment? That coffee shop you love, do you love it because of how the coffee tastes to you, or because it's the kind of place someone like you is supposed to love? The clothes in your closet, the opinions you express at dinner parties, even the way you spend your free time, how much of it represents a genuine choice versus an unconscious conformity to what's expected? What makes automaton conformity so insidious is that it doesn't feel like giving up freedom. In fact, it often feels like the opposite. We feel like we're making choices, expressing ourselves, living authentically. But Fromm argues that we're actually just performing a version of selfhood that's been scripted for us by our culture, our social media feeds, our peer groups. As we move deeper into Fromm's analysis, we begin to see how these escape mechanisms aren't just individual psychological quirks. They're responses to the fundamental challenge of human existence. The question becomes, if these are the ways we typically escape from freedom, what would it look like to actually embrace it? You know, as we settle into this next part of Fromm's journey through the human psyche, I want you to imagine something with me. Picture a person standing at the edge of a vast, open field. Behind them is a small, cramped cage with the door wide open. Now, here's the puzzling part. Instead of celebrating their freedom to explore that endless field, they keep glancing back at the cage, almost longingly. This isn't just a metaphor, my friend. This is exactly what Fromm discovered about human nature, and it's going to shake up everything you thought you knew about freedom. Fromm calls this phenomenon authoritarianism, and it's not what you might think. We're not talking about dictators here. Well, not entirely. We're talking about something much more intimate and personal. It's about why people, when faced with the overwhelming responsibility of freedom, sometimes choose to hand over their autonomy to someone else. Think about it. Have you ever felt relieved when someone else made a difficult decision for you? That moment of, thank goodness, I don't have to figure this out. That's the seed of what Fromm is exploring. Now here's where it gets really fascinating. Fromm identifies what he calls the authoritarian character, and this isn't just about people who bow down to tyrants. This character has two sides, like a coin that's been spinning in the air for so long we forget it has to land somewhere. On one side, there's the submissive aspect, the part that craves someone stronger to follow, to worship, to surrender to. On the other side, there's the dominating aspect, the part that needs to control others, to have power over them. And here's the kicker, these aren't different types of people. They're often the same person, expressing different faces of the same underlying anxiety about freedom. Let me paint you a picture that might hit close to home. Think about that colleague who's always deferential to the boss, hanging on their every word, never questioning authority. But then watch how they treat the intern or the cleaning staff. Suddenly, they're the one demanding submission, the one who needs to feel superior. Fromm would say this person is caught in what he calls the symbiotic relationship. They can only feel secure when they're either completely dominated or completely dominating someone else. The middle ground, that space where equals meet equals, terrifies them. But why does this happen? Fromm takes us deep into the psychology here, and it's both heartbreaking and illuminating. He suggests that this authoritarian character develops when people feel fundamentally isolated and powerless. Freedom, instead of feeling like a gift, feels like a burden too heavy to carry. Imagine a child who's been told what to do every moment of their life suddenly being asked to choose their own path. The paralysis can be overwhelming. Now think about this in our modern world. How many times have you seen someone completely delegate their thinking to a political figure, a celebrity, or even a social media influencer? They don't just agree with these figures, they seem to merge with them, adopting their opinions wholesale, defending them as if their own identity depended on it. Fromm would recognize this immediately. It's not really about the leader at all. It's about escaping the anxiety of having to think, choose, and be responsible for one's own life. The really chilling part is how this plays out in relationships. Fromm describes how people in authoritarian relationships don't really love each other in the way we typically understand love. Instead, they're using each other to escape from themselves. The submissive partner feels safe and protected, while the dominating partner feels powerful and significant, but neither is really seeing the other as a complete, autonomous human being. They're both just trying to solve their own freedom problem. Here's something that might surprise you. Fromm argues that this isn't just a personal issue. It's cultural, it's historical, it's deeply woven into how societies function. When people feel economically insecure, when traditional structures are crumbling, when the future feels uncertain, the appeal of authoritarianism grows. Sound familiar? We're living through exactly these conditions right now, and we can see this dynamic playing out on a massive scale. But here's what I find most hopeful about Fromm's analysis. He's not saying this is inevitable or permanent. He's diagnosing a condition that can be understood and potentially healed. The authoritarian character isn't born evil or broken. They're responding to real feelings of isolation and powerlessness in the only way they know how. The question Fromm leaves us with is profound. Can we learn to bear the weight of freedom without crushing ourselves or surrendering it to someone else? Can we find ways to connect with others that don't require dominance or submission? As we're about to see in our next exploration, Fromm believes there might be another way entirely, a path that leads neither to the cage nor to crushing isolation, but to something he calls spontaneous love and creative work. But that's a story for our next conversation, and trust me, it's going to change how you think about what it really means to be free. You know how sometimes when we're faced with a really difficult decision or overwhelming responsibility, we might find ourselves suddenly picking a fight with someone, or maybe scrolling through social media just to find something that makes us angry. Well, Fromm had some fascinating insights about this very human tendency, and what he discovered might surprise you. Picture this scenario. You're sitting at your kitchen table, staring at a pile of bills you can't afford to pay, or maybe you've just been offered a promotion that terrifies you because of all the new responsibilities it would bring. The weight of choice, of freedom, feels crushing. And then what happens? Your partner walks in and mentions they forgot to buy milk, and suddenly you're having a massive argument about something completely unrelated to what's really bothering you. Sound familiar? Fromm called this destructiveness, and he saw it as one of the most common ways we try to escape from the burden of freedom. Now, think about this for a moment. When we're being destructive, whether it's lashing out at others, tearing down institutions, or even engaging in self-sabotage, what are we really doing? We're trying to eliminate the very things that remind us we have choices to make. It's like being in a room with too many doors and deciding the solution is to burn the whole house down rather than choose which door to walk through. The destructive impulse says, if I can't handle having options, I'll just destroy the options themselves. But here's the thing Fromm understood so clearly. This destruction doesn't actually free us from anything. It just creates a different kind of prison. Let's think about this on a personal level first. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to sabotage every good thing that comes their way? They get into a wonderful relationship and then pick fights until it falls apart. They land a great job and then show up late until they get fired. They start getting healthy and then binge on junk food until they're back where they started. What's really happening here isn't bad luck or lack of willpower. It's the fear of freedom in action. When good things happen to us, they often come with increased responsibility and more choices to make. That loving relationship means choosing to be vulnerable every day. That great job means choosing to show up and perform at a higher level. Getting healthy means choosing better habits constantly. For someone who's terrified of the weight of these choices, destruction becomes a way out. If there's nothing good left to lose, then there are no difficult decisions to make about how to keep it. But Fromm's insights go far beyond individual psychology. He saw this same destructive escape playing out on massive social scales, and boy, does this feel relevant when we look around at our world today. Think about political movements that seem more focused on tearing down institutions than building better ones. Consider how some groups channel their fear of an uncertain future into hatred of other groups, as if eliminating the other will somehow solve the fundamental challenge of having to choose how to live. Here's where it gets really interesting. Fromm noticed that destructiveness often masquerades as strength or righteousness. The person who's constantly criticizing others feels superior and powerful. The political movement that's focused on destruction feels like it's fighting for something important. But underneath all that apparent strength is actually a profound weakness, a terror of having to stand up and make constructive choices about how to build a better life or a better world. Now you might be wondering, but isn't some destruction necessary? Don't we sometimes need to tear down bad systems to build better ones? And you're absolutely right to ask that question. Fromm wasn't arguing that all destruction is bad. He was specifically talking about destruction as an escape mechanism, destruction that serves no constructive purpose but simply eliminates choices we don't want to face. The difference is this: constructive destruction is followed by building something better. It's purposeful and directed toward a positive goal, but destructive escape just leaves emptiness behind. It's like the difference between demolishing an old building to construct a beautiful new one versus just setting fire to things because you can't stand looking at them anymore. In our modern world, we see this destructive escape everywhere. Social media has given us incredible tools for tearing things down, for expressing outrage and anger, but notice how rarely these platforms lead to actual constructive change. It's so much easier to tweet angrily about a problem than to roll up your sleeves and work on solutions. The destruction feels satisfying in the moment, but it doesn't actually improve anything. The real tragedy, as Fromm saw it, is that this destructive escape robs us of our authentic power. When we're busy tearing things down to avoid making choices, we're not using our energy to build the life or the world we actually want. We're trapped in a cycle of reaction rather than creation, of fear rather than courage. Understanding this pattern is the first step toward breaking free from it, toward finding healthier ways to deal with the inevitable anxiety that comes with being truly free. Picture this: you're sitting in a coffee shop, watching the morning rush hour through the window. Hundreds of people stream by, all dressed remarkably similarly, carrying the same style of bags, checking the same type of phones, walking with the same hurried pace. There's something both comforting and unsettling about this scene, isn't there? This is exactly what Erich Fromm was getting at when he explored what he called automaton conformity, perhaps one of the most chilling yet familiar escape routes from the burden of individual freedom. Now think about this for a moment. We've already seen how people flee from freedom through authoritarian submission and destructive aggression. But there's a third path, one that's far more subtle and in many ways more prevalent in our modern world. It's the path of becoming what Fromm called a pseudo-self, essentially turning yourself into a carbon copy of what you think others expect you to be. Imagine a chameleon, but instead of changing colors to match its environment for survival, it changes so completely that it forgets its original color entirely. This is automaton conformity in action. The individual adopts the kind of personality offered to them by cultural patterns, becoming so thoroughly what others expect them to be that they lose touch with who they genuinely are. It's like wearing a mask for so long that your face grows to match it. Fromm paints a vivid picture of this phenomenon. He describes how modern individuals often feel like actors playing a role they never auditioned for, reading from a script they didn't write. The businessman who talks only about quarterly reports and market trends, even at his daughter's birthday party. The suburban mother who obsesses over Pinterest perfect home decor while feeling empty inside. The college student who chooses a major based entirely on what will impress others, never stopping to ask what actually ignites their passion. What makes this escape mechanism so insidious is that it doesn't feel like escape at all. Unlike the obviously troubling paths of submission to authority or destructive behavior, automaton conformity feels safe, normal, even virtuous. Society rewards it with approval, success, and belonging. You fit in, you don't rock the boat, you're a good citizen or a team player. But beneath this socially acceptable surface lurks a profound emptiness. Think about the last time you were in a business meeting where everyone nodded along to an idea they privately thought was terrible. Or consider how many people spend their weekends doing activities they don't actually enjoy because that's what people in their social circle are supposed to do. This is automaton conformity at work, the gradual surrender of authentic selfhood in exchange for the illusion of security and belonging. Fromm argues that this conformity creates what he calls a pseudo-self, a false identity constructed entirely from external expectations and social roles. The pseudo-self is like a sophisticated puppet that has learned to pull its own strings so well that even the puppet forgets there was once a real person underneath. The individual becomes estranged from their own thoughts, feelings, and desires, experiencing them as foreign or irrelevant. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Fromm suggests that this pseudo-self creates a particular kind of anxiety, not the anxiety of making difficult choices or standing alone, but the anxiety of never quite knowing if you're performing your role correctly. It's like being an actor who's never actually read the full script and constantly worries about missing their cue or delivering the wrong line. Consider how this plays out in our digital age. Social media has turbocharged automaton conformity, creating platforms where people curate pseudo-selves for public consumption. The carefully filtered Instagram photos, the LinkedIn posts that sound like they were written by corporate robots, the Twitter personalities that shift with whatever's trending. These are all modern manifestations of what Fromm was describing decades ago. We're not just conforming to our immediate social circles anymore. We're conforming to algorithmic expectations and the phantom approval of strangers. But perhaps most tragically, Fromm observes that people trapped in automaton conformity often don't even realize they're trapped. The pseudo-self feels real because it's all they've known for so long. They mistake their carefully constructed persona for their authentic identity. It's like someone who's been wearing colored contact lenses for years and forgets their natural eye color. The workplace provides endless examples of this phenomenon. How many people do you know who speak in corporate jargon even in casual conversation, who have absorbed the personality of their profession so completely that they've lost touch with who they were before they became a lawyer, or a marketing executive, or a consultant? They've become human embodiments of their job descriptions. What makes automaton conformity particularly relevant today is how it masquerades as individual choice. Unlike authoritarian submission, which is obviously coercive, conformity feels voluntary. People choose their clothes, their cars, their lifestyles, but these choices are made from such a narrow range of culturally approved options that the freedom is largely illusory. It's like being told you can paint your house any color you want, as long as it's beige. As we move forward in exploring Fromm's insights, we'll discover that recognizing automaton conformity is the first step toward genuine freedom, the kind that doesn't require escaping from ourselves. Picture yourself sitting in a cafe in 1930s Germany, watching ordinary people, teachers, shopkeepers, factory workers, gradually transform into supporters of one of history's most destructive movements. How does this happen? How do rational human beings willingly surrender their freedom to a dictator? This is the haunting question Erich Fromm tackles as he dissects the psychology behind Nazism's rise. And what he discovers will fundamentally change how you understand the human relationship with freedom itself. Fromm reveals something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. We have a love-hate relationship with freedom. Think about this for a moment. Freedom sounds wonderful in theory, but it comes with a terrifying burden. When you're truly free, You must make your own choices, bear responsibility for your mistakes, and face an uncertain future without guarantees. It's like being handed the keys to a car when you've never learned to drive, exhilarating and absolutely terrifying at the same time. In post-World War I Germany, this psychological tension reached a breaking point. The old social order had crumbled, traditional authorities had failed, and millions of people found themselves adrift in a sea of economic chaos and political uncertainty. Imagine losing your job, watching your savings evaporate due to hyperinflation, and seeing your entire worldview collapse, all while being told you're now free to chart your own course. For many Germans, this freedom felt less like liberation and more like being thrown into an ocean without knowing how to swim. This is where Nazism's psychological genius becomes clear. Hitler didn't simply impose his will through force. He offered something far more seductive, an escape from the burden of individual choice. The Nazi movement presented itself as the ultimate solution to the anxiety of freedom. Join us, they whispered, and you'll never have to make another difficult decision. We'll tell you who you are, what you should think, and where you belong. We'll transform your uncertainty into certainty, your isolation into belonging, your weakness into strength. Fromm identifies this as the escape from freedom, the unconscious desire to surrender individual autonomy in exchange for security and belonging. It's like a psychological security blanket that promises to protect you from life's harsh realities. The Nazis understood that people would willingly trade their freedom for the illusion of safety and the intoxicating feeling of being part of something larger than themselves. Consider how this manipulation worked in practice. Nazi rallies weren't just political events. They were carefully orchestrated psychological experiences designed to dissolve individual identity into collective euphoria. Picture thousands of people moving, chanting, and thinking as one organism. In those moments, personal doubts vanished, replaced by the overwhelming sensation of power and belonging. Participants didn't just support Nazi ideology, they became it, losing themselves so completely in the group that individual conscience simply disappeared. But here's what makes Fromm's analysis so relevant today. This psychological pattern didn't die with Hitler. The same mechanisms that drove ordinary Germans to embrace authoritarianism continue to operate in modern societies. Think about how social media algorithms create echo chambers that eliminate the discomfort of encountering opposing viewpoints. Consider how political movements on both extremes offer their followers simple explanations for complex problems, promising that all difficulties will vanish if you just surrender your critical thinking to the group's wisdom. The escape from freedom manifests differently in our era, but the underlying psychology remains unchanged. When faced with overwhelming choices, which career to pursue, what to believe about climate change, how to navigate relationships in the digital age, many people unconsciously seek authorities who will make these decisions for them. Whether it's following influencers who tell you exactly how to live, joining political movements that demand absolute loyalty, or losing yourself in consumer culture that promises happiness through purchasing decisions, the pattern persists. Fromm's insight cuts even deeper when he examines how economic systems can facilitate this escape. In Nazi Germany, individuals found relief from the burden of economic uncertainty by surrendering to a totalitarian system that promised to manage everything. Today, we might ask ourselves, how often do we surrender our autonomy to corporate systems, algorithmic recommendations, or social pressures that promise to simplify our lives? When Netflix tells you what to watch, when GPS tells you where to go, when social media tells you what to think, are these conveniences, or are they subtle forms of escaping the responsibility of choice? The tragedy Fromm illuminates is that this escape is ultimately an illusion. Those who surrender their freedom to avoid anxiety discover that they've traded temporary relief for a far more profound form of suffering. They become strangers to themselves, cut off from their own authentic desires and capabilities. The very thing that makes us human, our capacity for conscious choice, withers away when we consistently avoid its exercise. Understanding the psychology of Nazism isn't just about comprehending historical events. It's about recognizing the ongoing struggle within each of us between the desire for freedom and the temptation to escape its demands. As we'll see in our next discussion, Fromm doesn't leave us trapped in this dilemma, but points toward a more mature relationship with freedom itself. You know how sometimes you're sitting in a coffee shop, watching people scroll through their phones, and you wonder if we're actually freer than people were centuries ago. That's exactly the kind of paradox Erich Fromm wrestles with when he examines the relationship between freedom and democracy. And honestly, his insights might surprise you more than that extra shot of espresso you didn't expect. Fromm starts with what seems like a simple premise, but stick with me here because it gets fascinating. He argues that democracy isn't just about voting or having rights on paper. Think about this for a moment. How many times have you felt completely powerless despite living in what we call a free society? Maybe it was dealing with bureaucracy, or feeling like your voice doesn't matter in the endless noise of social media, or watching political decisions being made that seem completely disconnected from your daily reality. Here's where Fromm's brilliance shines through. He suggests that true democratic freedom isn't just the absence of external constraints, it's the positive presence of genuine choice and meaningful participation. Imagine democracy as a garden, not just a fence. The fence keeps the bad stuff out, sure, but what really matters is whether anything beautiful and nourishing can actually grow inside. Now think about this. We often confuse freedom from something with freedom to something. Fromm illustrates this beautifully by comparing modern democratic citizens to people who have been given the keys to a magnificent library but have never learned to read. Technically, they have access to all human knowledge, but practically, they're just as limited as if the doors were locked. This is the crux of what he calls the democratic paradox. Consider how this plays out in our daily lives. You have the freedom to choose from 30 different breakfast cereals at the grocery store, but do you have the freedom to influence what kinds of food systems exist in the first place? You can vote for candidates, but do you have meaningful input into what issues even make it onto the political agenda? Fromm would say this isn't really freedom at all. It's what he calls the illusion of choice within predetermined boundaries. But here's where it gets really interesting, and why Fromm isn't just another pessimistic critic. He believes democracy contains within it the seeds of genuine liberation, but only if we understand what that actually requires. True democratic freedom, he argues, demands active participation, critical thinking, and most importantly, the courage to take responsibility for our collective destiny. Let me share an analogy that might make this clearer. Imagine you're part of a book club where everyone gets to vote on which book to read next, but only 3 books are ever presented as options, and those 3 are chosen by someone else entirely. You're participating in a democratic process, but your freedom is severely constrained. Real democratic freedom would mean you could also propose books, influence how the selection process works, and maybe even question whether reading books together is the best use of your time in the first place. Fromm saw this dynamic playing out dramatically in the political upheavals of his era, particularly the rise of fascism in Europe. Now, you might be thinking, that's ancient history, but consider how relevant this feels today. Think about how people can feel so frustrated with traditional democratic institutions that they become attracted to authoritarian leaders who promise simple solutions. It's not that these people hate freedom. It's that they've never experienced the kind of meaningful democratic participation that Fromm describes. Here's what makes Fromm's analysis so powerful. He understands that democracy isn't a destination, it's a practice. It's like learning to play music. You don't just get handed an instrument and suddenly become free to create beautiful sounds. You have to develop skills, understand harmony, learn to listen to others, and most importantly, find your own voice within the larger composition. This connects to something we see everywhere today. Social media platforms tell us we have unprecedented freedom to express ourselves and connect with others. But how often do these interactions feel genuinely democratic? Are we participating in meaningful dialogue? Or are we just shouting into echo chambers while algorithms decide what we see and who hears us? Fromm would argue that real democratic freedom requires what he calls positive freedom, the capacity for genuine self-expression and authentic connection with others. It means developing our critical faculties, taking responsibility for our choices, and actively participating in shaping the world around us rather than just consuming what's presented to us. As we move into exploring Fromm's ideas about authority and conformity, keep this foundation in mind. Democracy isn't just a political system. It's a way of being human that requires constant cultivation and courage. The question isn't whether we live in a democracy, but whether we're actively creating democratic freedom in our daily lives. One choice, one conversation, one moment of genuine engagement at a time. So we've been exploring how people can escape from the kind of freedom that terrifies them, and now Fromm takes us somewhere really fascinating. He's asking, what if we could actually prepare people for real freedom from the very beginning? What if, instead of creating educational systems that churn out anxious conformists, we designed learning environments that help people become genuinely free human beings? Picture this with me for a moment. You walk into most classrooms today, and what do you see? Rows of desks facing forward, students sitting quietly, absorbing information they'll regurgitate on tests and then promptly forget. The teacher stands at the front, dispensing knowledge like a vending machine dispensing snacks. Everyone's focused on the right answer, the correct response, the acceptable opinion. Sound familiar? Fromm would say this isn't education at all. It's training for authoritarianism. Now think about this. What if that same classroom looked completely different? What if students were grappling with real questions that mattered to them, learning to think critically about the world around them, developing the courage to form their own opinions and stand by them? What if instead of memorizing facts, they were learning how to question, how to doubt, how to think for themselves? That's what Fromm means by education for freedom. But here's where it gets really interesting. Fromm isn't just talking about changing teaching methods or updating curricula. He's talking about something much more fundamental, creating an environment where young people can develop what he calls positive freedom. Remember, positive freedom isn't just the absence of external constraints. It's the presence of genuine self-direction, the ability to act according to your own authentic will rather than being driven by unconscious fears or social pressures. Let me share a story that illustrates this beautifully. Imagine a young student named Sarah who's always been told she's not good at math. In a traditional classroom, she might internalize this label, accepting it as truth and avoiding anything mathematical for the rest of her life. But in an environment designed for freedom, something different happens. Instead of being labeled and categorized, Sarah is encouraged to explore her own relationship with numbers and problem solving. Maybe she discovers she thinks about math differently than others, but that doesn't make her thinking wrong, just different. Maybe she finds connections between mathematical concepts and music, or art, or storytelling. The point isn't whether she becomes a mathematician. It's that she learns to trust her own thinking process and doesn't let external judgments define her capabilities. This is what Fromm means when he talks about education that cultivates spontaneity and originality. Think about the children in your life, maybe your own kids or nieces and nephews or just kids you observe in the world. Young children are naturally curious, naturally questioning, naturally creative. They ask why about everything. They make up elaborate games and stories. They see the world with fresh eyes, but somewhere along the way many of them lose this spark. They learn that there are right answers and wrong answers, acceptable thoughts and unacceptable ones. They learn to color inside the lines, both literally and metaphorically. Now here's a question that might make you uncomfortable. How much of your own education was really about learning to think versus learning to comply? How often were you encouraged to challenge ideas, to question authority, to form your own opinions about complex issues? If you're like most people, the answer might be not very often. And this isn't necessarily because your teachers were bad people. They were probably products of the same system, trying their best within structures that weren't designed for freedom. Fromm argues that real educational reform has to address this fundamental tension. We can't create free human beings in unfree institutions. We can't teach independence through methods that demand conformity. We can't nurture critical thinking while punishing questions that make us uncomfortable. But what would education for freedom actually look like in practice? Fromm suggests several key elements. First, it would prioritize the development of the whole person, not just the accumulation of information. Students would learn about their own emotions, their own thinking patterns, their own values and beliefs. They develop what we might call emotional intelligence alongside intellectual capabilities. Second, this kind of education would be deeply collaborative rather than competitive. Instead of pitting students against each other in a race for grades and rankings, it would help them learn from each other, support each other, and recognize that everyone has something valuable to contribute. Think about how different your own school experience might have been if cooperation had been valued over competition. Third, education for freedom would connect learning to real life, to actual problems and challenges that matter. Students wouldn't just study history, they'd grapple with how historical patterns show up in current events. They wouldn't just learn about science, they'd use scientific thinking to understand issues in their own communities. As we move toward exploring how these ideas might transform our approach to learning and growing, consider this. What would it mean for our society if we raised generations of people who were genuinely free, not just legally free, but psychologically and emotionally equipped for the responsibilities and challenges that real freedom brings? So we've journeyed through Fromm's exploration of how we've escaped from medieval bonds only to find ourselves facing new forms of bondage. And now we arrive at perhaps the most hopeful and challenging part of his entire work. What lies beyond freedom as we know it? Picture yourself sitting across from Fromm in a quiet cafe, steam rising from your coffee cups, as he leans forward with that intense yet gentle look in his eyes and asks you the ultimate question. What does it really mean to be free? You know, when most of us think about freedom, we immediately think about freedom from something, don't we? Freedom from oppression, freedom from want, freedom from interference. But Fromm is inviting us to flip that script entirely and think about freedom to something. What are we free to become? What are we free to create? What are we free to love? It's like the difference between breaking out of a prison cell and actually having somewhere meaningful to go once you're outside. Think about this for a moment. Imagine you've spent years in a job you hate, dreaming of the day you could quit. Finally, that day comes. You walk out those office doors for the last time, and suddenly you're hit with a wave of panic. Now what? The freedom from your terrible job is exhilarating for about 5 minutes, but then the weight of infinite possibility becomes almost crushing. This is exactly what Fromm sees happening to modern society on a massive scale. He argues that true freedom, what he calls positive freedom, isn't just the absence of chains but the presence of genuine self-realization. It's not enough to escape from external authorities if we haven't developed our own inner authority, our own authentic voice. Picture a bird that spent its entire life in a cage. When you open that cage door, the bird might actually choose to stay inside because the vast sky feels more terrifying than the familiar bars. Now Fromm isn't naive about this. He knows that developing this kind of authentic freedom requires something that feels almost impossible in our modern world: genuine spontaneity and the courage to be vulnerable. He talks about love, but not the Hollywood version we're fed constantly. He means love as an active concern for the growth and happiness of another person, love as a creative act that requires us to step outside ourselves. When was the last time you felt that kind of love, either giving it or receiving it? Not the possessive, clinging kind that says, "you complete me," but the generous, expansive kind that says, I want to see you become who you're meant to be. Here's where Fromm gets really practical and, frankly, a bit radical for his time and ours. He suggests that the path beyond freedom requires us to fundamentally reimagine our economic and social structures. Think about your typical workday. How much of it involves genuine creativity, real problem-solving, authentic connection with others? For most of us, the honest answer is depressingly little. We're like highly sophisticated hamsters running on increasingly complex wheels, producing value for systems we barely understand, let alone control. But Fromm envisions something different. He talks about work that engages our whole selves, communities where people know and care about each other, economic systems designed around human flourishing rather than abstract growth metrics. Sounds utopian, doesn't it? But consider this. We already have examples of this kind of thing working. Think about the best team you've ever been part of, whether at work, in sports, or in some creative project. Remember that feeling of everyone contributing their unique strengths towards something meaningful. That's a tiny glimpse of what Fromm is talking about. The challenge, and Fromm is brutally honest about this, is that moving toward positive freedom requires us to give up some of our comfortable illusions. We have to stop pretending that having 47 different breakfast cereals to choose from represents meaningful freedom. We have to acknowledge that our frantic busyness might be a way of avoiding the deeper question of what we actually want to do with our lives. We have to face the possibility that some of our most cherished beliefs about success, happiness, and the good life might be borrowed from sources that don't actually have our best interests at heart. What's fascinating is how relevant this feels today, decades after Fromm wrote these words. We're drowning in choices about what to stream, what to buy, how to optimize our productivity, but how often do we get to make choices about what really matters? How often do we get to participate in creating the kind of world we want to live in? Fromm's vision of positive freedom isn't about returning to some imagined golden age or escaping to a desert island. It's about becoming more fully human within the complexity of modern life. It's about developing what he calls productive character, the ability to engage creatively and lovingly with the world around us, even when that world seems designed to discourage exactly that kind of engagement. As we wrap up this exploration of Fromm's remarkable insights, we're left not with easy answers but with better questions. Questions that invite us to examine our own lives with fresh eyes and perhaps, just perhaps, to take the next small step toward the kind of freedom that actually sets us free. Picture yourself sitting in a bustling cafe in any major city today. Look around and you'll see something fascinating. Despite being surrounded by more individual choices than any generation in human history, many people seem anxious, disconnected, scrolling endlessly through their phones, as if searching for something they can't quite name. This paradox brings us to one of Erich Fromm's most profound insights about how culture shapes our very understanding of what freedom means. Fromm understood something that most of us miss in our daily lives. Freedom isn't just a political concept or a personal feeling. It's deeply, fundamentally shaped by the cultural water we swim in. Think about this for a moment. When you hear the word freedom, what immediately comes to mind? If you're like most people in Western society, you probably think about individual choice, personal autonomy, the right to do what you want without interference. But here's where it gets interesting. That very definition of freedom is itself a cultural product, shaped by centuries of specific historical experiences, values, and social structures. Fromm takes us on a journey through different cultures and historical periods to show us just how malleable our concept of freedom really is. In medieval society, for instance, freedom meant something entirely different. A medieval craftsman didn't think of freedom as the ability to choose any career path imaginable. Instead, freedom was found within the security of knowing your place, your role, your community. The blacksmith's son became a blacksmith, and this wasn't seen as limitation but as belonging, as having a clear identity and purpose within a stable social order. Now you might be thinking, Well, that sounds terribly restrictive. And from our modern perspective, it does. But Fromm asks us to consider what that medieval person gained that we might have lost. They had what he calls primary bonds with their community, their craft, their place in the world. These bonds provided not just economic security but psychological security. They knew who they were, where they belonged, and what their life meant. Fast forward to our contemporary culture, and we see how dramatically our understanding of freedom has shifted. We celebrate individual choice above almost everything else. We have dating apps with thousands of potential partners, career paths that didn't exist 5 years ago, lifestyle choices that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. We can reinvent ourselves, move across the world, change our entire identity. This is the freedom we cherish, the freedom we export, the freedom we assume is the highest form of human liberation. But here's where Fromm's analysis becomes particularly sharp and relevant to our current moment. He observed that this cultural emphasis on individual freedom often comes with a hidden cost. When we're constantly told that we're free to choose anything, we can also become paralyzed by the weight of that choice. When every life path is possible, how do we choose? When we're responsible for creating our own meaning, our own identity, our own purpose, the burden can become overwhelming. Consider the modern phenomenon of FOMO, or the fear of missing out. This anxiety is deeply cultural and directly related to how our society frames freedom. We're told we can have anything, be anything, do anything, and so we become terrified that we're making the wrong choices, missing better opportunities, failing to optimize our lives. The medieval craftsman never worried about whether he should have been a merchant instead. His culture didn't present that as a meaningful question. Fromm also explores how different cultures create different escape mechanisms from the burden of freedom. Some cultures emphasize conformity, where freedom is found through blending in, following social expectations, not standing out. Think about certain corporate cultures where everyone dresses the same, thinks the same, speaks the same corporate language. There's a kind of relief in that conformity, a freedom from the anxiety of having to be unique or different. Other cultures promote what Fromm calls destructiveness, where freedom is expressed through tearing down existing structures, rebelling against authority, defining oneself in opposition to others. We see this in various countercultural movements, in political extremism, in the way some online communities define themselves primarily through what they're against rather than what they're for. Perhaps most relevant to our current digital age is what Fromm identified as automaton conformity. This is where we think we're expressing our individuality, but we're actually just following mass-produced templates of what individuality should look like. Think about social media, where millions of people express their unique personalities using the same filters, the same poses, the same hashtags, the same platforms designed by a handful of tech companies. The profound insight here is that culture doesn't just influence how we express our freedom, it literally shapes what we think freedom is. Our desires, our fears, our very sense of self are all cultural products. This doesn't mean freedom is an illusion, but it does mean that understanding true freedom requires understanding the cultural forces that shape our perception of it. As we move forward in exploring Fromm's ideas, we'll see how this cultural analysis becomes the foundation for understanding why so many people, despite living in societies that celebrate individual liberty, still feel trapped, anxious, and strangely unfree. The key lies not just in having choices, but in understanding the deeper cultural currents that shape how we make those choices and what they mean to us. So we've journeyed through the dark valleys of authoritarianism and the sometimes lonely peaks of individual freedom, and now Fromm brings us to what might be the most hopeful part of his entire exploration. Picture yourself sitting by a window on a rainy afternoon, and suddenly the clouds part to reveal a brilliant sunset. That's what this vision of humanism feels like after everything we've discussed about escape from freedom. Fromm isn't content to simply diagnose the problem and walk away. He's like that friend who not only tells you what's wrong with your relationship, but actually helps you figure out how to build something better. And what he's proposing isn't some utopian fantasy floating in the clouds, but a practical way of organizing society that honors both our need for individual expression and our deep hunger for genuine connection. Think about this for a moment. What if freedom didn't have to mean isolation? What if belonging didn't require surrendering your authentic self? Fromm suggests that the answer lies in what he calls productive love and productive work, concepts that sound simple but are actually revolutionary when you really dig into them. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a small Italian village where the local baker doesn't just make bread to maximize profit, but because he genuinely cares about nourishing his community. He knows Mrs. Romano prefers her crust a little softer because of her dentures, and he remembers that young Paolo is allergic to certain ingredients. This baker is free to express his creativity through his craft, yet his freedom is intimately connected to the well-being of others. He's not escaping into some isolated bubble of self-interest, nor is he mechanically following orders from some distant corporate headquarters. This is what Fromm means by productive work, where our individual talents serve something larger than ourselves without diminishing who we are. Now you might be thinking, that sounds lovely, but what about the real world? What about modern corporations and global markets? Here's where Fromm's vision gets really interesting. He's not advocating for a return to some romanticized past, but for a fundamental shift in how we structure our economic and social relationships. Consider companies today that prioritize employee well-being and environmental sustainability alongside profits. Think about worker cooperatives where decisions are made democratically, or communities that practice mutual aid during crises. These aren't just feel-good stories. They're glimpses of what humanistic organization might look like in practice. The key insight Fromm offers is that true freedom isn't the absence of connection, but the presence of authentic, voluntary relationships. It's like the difference between being alone in a crowd and being peacefully solitary in nature. In the crowd, you're isolated despite being surrounded by people. In nature, you're connected to something vast and meaningful even though you're physically alone. Productive love, in Fromm's framework, isn't the desperate clinging we often mistake for love, nor is it the detached indifference we sometimes call independence. It's the kind of love that sees others clearly, accepts them as they are, yet also encourages their growth and flourishing. Think about the best teacher you ever had. They probably didn't try to mold you into their image, nor did they simply leave you to figure everything out on your own. Instead, they saw your potential and created conditions where you could discover and develop it yourself. This translates into social organization in fascinating ways. A humanistic society would be structured around what serves human development rather than what serves abstract principles or institutional power. Laws would exist not to control behavior through fear, but to create frameworks where people can flourish together. Economic systems would measure success not just in terms of efficiency or growth, but in terms of whether they help people become more fully human. Now, think about this in terms of our current moment. We're living through what many call a crisis of democracy, where people feel disconnected from the institutions that govern their lives. Fromm would say this is partly because our systems have become ends in themselves rather than means to human flourishing. When voting feels meaningless, when work feels pointless, when community feels impossible to find, people naturally begin to escape from the burden of freedom into various forms of submission or destructive rebellion. But what if we could reimagine these structures? What if political participation meant more than just choosing between predetermined options every few years? What if work could be a form of creative expression and social contribution? What if communities could be places where individual uniqueness is celebrated precisely because it contributes to collective richness? This vision isn't naive about human nature. Fromm understands that people can be selfish, fearful, and destructive, but he argues that these tendencies are often responses to systems that pit us against each other rather than encouraging cooperation. When people feel secure in their basic needs and valued for their authentic contributions, they're much more likely to act in ways that benefit everyone. As we prepare to wrap up our journey through Fromm's profound insights, this humanistic vision stands as both destination and compass, pointing toward possibilities that honor both our individual dignity and our fundamental interconnectedness. Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom intricately explores the paradoxical nature of modern freedom, the liberation from traditional bonds, and the simultaneous burden of isolation it brings. Fromm delves into the psychological impacts of this freedom, examining how individuals often escape from the responsibility of true freedom through conformity and authoritarianism. By understanding these dynamics, we can better navigate our personal lives and societal structures. Here are some key takeaways. 1. Embrace individual responsibility. Freedom comes with the weight of responsibility. Start incredibly small by owning your daily decisions, whether it's your morning routine or the way you interact with others. Gradually, this practice will empower you to take charge of larger life choices. 2. Foster critical thinking. Instead of blindly following authority or societal norms, question and reflect on them. Engage in discussions that challenge your perspectives and encourage growth. Read widely and journal your thoughts to cultivate a habit of critical analysis. 3. Build authentic connections. As social beings, genuine relationships safeguard us against feelings of isolation. Make it a point to connect deeply with one person each week, have a meaningful conversation, or share a personal story. This nurtures bonds that transcend superficial interactions. 4. Cultivate inner freedom. True freedom is an internal state. Practice mindfulness and meditation to become more aware of your inner thoughts and emotions. Start with just 5 minutes a day to build an awareness that shields against external pressures. 5. Balance conformity and individuality. While social norms provide structure, blindly adhering to them can stifle personal growth. Identify areas where you've conformed without question and experiment with small changes to express your individuality. Be patient with yourself as you navigate this balance. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with at least one idea from this book that stuck with you, one concept you're going to carry forward. It could be something that challenged your thinking, something you want to try, or even something you disagreed with. Your insight might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And if this summary gave you something valuable, a new perspective, a spark of motivation, or even just a peaceful hour with your coffee, share it with someone who might need it too. Subscribe to One Book, One Coffee, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new summary. Every week, we sit down together with one great book, one warm cup of coffee, and the simple belief that wisdom, shared well, can change lives. Until next time, keep reading, keep growing, and remember, every small step counts. See you at the next book.